rain fell steadily, tapping against the windows like 1,000 impatient fingers. It was the kind of evening that invited contemplation, yet no one in the quiet town of Merwick could afford the luxury of such peace. In the grand, crumbling manor of the Dunsford family, a crime had just been committed, one that, at first glance, seemed to mock the very notion of logic. It was a private affair, the type of gathering reserved for family and a few close friends. Yet, in the centre of the old drawing-room, beneath the haunting glow of the chandelier, something horrified them all. The body of Lord Edmund Dunsford lay sprawled on the floor, his life extinguished in a manner that seemed almost too theatrical. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. His hands, tightly clenched, grasped something in the palm of his right hand, a silver mask. It was a delicate object, crafted from the finest metal, engraved with intricate symbols that no one could immediately identify. The mask itself was cold to the touch, its sharp edges cutting into Lord Dunsford's palm with an unnatural precision. What struck the witnesses most was the fact that there was no sign of struggle. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, nothing that suggested a typical method of murder. The door had been locked from the inside, and when the family discovered the crime, there was no way to explain how the killer had entered or left the room. An unsolvable crime indeed. As the family gathered in stunned disbelief around the lifeless figure, an air of unease clung to the atmosphere like smoke. Their collective whispers bounced off the grandiose walls, too frightened to even entertain the possibility that something supernatural might be at play. And yet, the silver mask seemed to carry with it an aura of ominous mystery. It was as though the object had arrived from another time, another world, somehow out of place, yet deeply rooted in the history of the Dunsford family. It was not long before Scotland Yard received the call, and a team of officers arrived at the estate. But it wasn't long before they realized that the case was far too complex for them to handle alone. It was then that Hercule Poirot, the famed Belgian detective known for his unparalleled intellect, was summoned to investigate. The police, though perplexed, had heard enough of his reputation to know that Poirot's methods were precisely what was needed. The train ride from London had been uneventful, yet Poirot could not shake the nagging feeling that this case would prove to be one of his most challenging. He stepped off the train and made his way to the Grand Manor, the damp evening air clinging to his coat. When he arrived, he was greeted by the estate steward, an anxious man named Mr. Collins, who led Poirot inside with haste. "I do not know how it is possible, Monsieur Poirot," Mr. Collins said, wringing his hands nervously. "None of us understand. We have been racking our brains for hours, yet no one can make sense of it." Poirot nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings with deliberate calculation. He could sense the tension in the air, the way the household seemed to collectively hold its breath. Lord Dunsford's body had been carefully placed in the centre of the room, under the watchful eyes of the family members, who looked more like suspects than mourners. Poirot took a moment to observe the scene, his mind processing every detail. The untouched brandy glass on the side table, the open window with rain trickling in, the faint smell of incense that lingered in the air. Nothing was out of place, and yet everything about the situation felt profoundly wrong. But what was it? What was the key that would unlock this enigma? He approached the body slowly, his eyes narrowing as he examined Lord Dunsford's face. It was frozen in a deathly expression, one that suggested a violent end. Poirot noticed the mask in the dead man's hand and took a few moments to study it. The symbols etched into the silver were unusual. An ancient design, perhaps, something that looked familiar, but Poirot could not immediately place it. His fingers grazed over the delicate surface, his mind working, always calculating. The room fell silent as Poirot's gaze shifted to the other members of the household. He took in their expressions, carefully analysing their reactions. There was Lady Margaret, Lord Dunsford's wife, whose eyes were red-rimmed from hours of crying. Then there was her sister, Miss Cecilia, a woman whose icy demeanour and hard gaze betrayed little emotion. Sir Thomas Carroway, a family friend, stood off to the side, his face pale but impassive, while young Miss Eleanor Dunsford, Lord Dunsford's daughter, sat in a corner, her hands trembling as she stared at her father's body. Poirot turned to Mr. Collins, who had been standing nervously nearby. "Tell me," Poirot began, his voice calm and measured, "was there anyone else in the manor at the time of the murder?" "No, Monsieur Poirot. Only the family and the staff. But none of us saw anyone enter or leave the room." Poirot raised an eyebrow, studying the steward with renewed interest. "And the silver mask. Have you seen it before?" Mr. Collins hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward the others. "No, Monsieur Poirot. It is unfamiliar to all of us." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his mind already piecing together the fragments of the case. He turned to the family, each person seemingly caught in their own world of grief or guilt, and addressed them in a voice that commanded their attention. "I will need to speak with each of you. Your cooperation will be essential in solving this mystery." The detective's presence was immediately felt in the room, his authority hanging heavy in the air. With each passing moment, Poirot knew that the solution to this baffling crime was just within reach, if only he could uncover the hidden connections that bound it all together. The silver mask, the locked door, the terror in Lord Dunsford's eyes, each element had a purpose. But what was that purpose? That Poirot would discover in time. And as the storm raged outside, the true nature of the crime was about to be revealed. Poirot surveyed the room, his sharp eyes missing nothing. The family members fidgeted, glancing nervously at one another, but they quickly straightened when he turned his attention to them. His mind was already working, turning over the evidence in his head, analysing each person, each object, each small detail in the room. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of unspoken words and suppressed emotions. But Poirot had learned long ago that people who are afraid often leave clues in their own behaviour. Lady Margaret was the first to speak. "Monsieur Poirot, we are all at a loss. We know no more than you do." Her voice trembled slightly, but it was hard to tell whether that was due to grief or something else. "Please tell us what we should do." Poirot's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, studying her features carefully, the slight twitch at the corner of her eye, the way she gripped her handkerchief with both hands, the false calmness of her posture. He had learned to notice such things over the years, these tiny, almost imperceptible signs of distress that the human mind often overlooked. But, as was his custom, he gave no outward sign that he had noticed her discomfort. Instead, he turned, his focus back to the room, his gaze narrowing as he took in the faint light reflected off the polished floors, the rich fabrics of the furniture, and the subtle shadows creeping into the corners. He stepped closer to Lord Dunsford's body. The man's stiffened expression, caught in that last terrified moment, had not changed. There was nothing strange about the way he lay, nothing that suggested a struggle, no violent marks on his skin. Yet there was something inherently wrong about the entire scene. Poirot crouched down beside the body, his mind clicking into a new gear as he examined the position of the corpse in relation to the room. The floorboards creaked faintly under his weight, a soft, rhythmic sound that almost seemed to echo louder in the silence. The mask. Poirot reached out and gently turned the silver mask in the dead man's hand, his fingers brushing over the symbols that had so intrigued him earlier. His mind raced through possibilities. It wasn't the mask itself that intrigued him, but the way it had been held firmly, desperately, as though it had been a last attempt to ward off some unseen threat. The thought struck him that the mask might not be the clue itself, but rather the thing the victim had been holding on to in the face of something far more terrifying. He could almost imagine Lord Dunsford's final moments, facing something he couldn't understand, something so terrifying that even in death, his hand refused to release it. As Poirot examined the mask, he heard the faintest rustle at the edge of the room. He didn't need to look to know it was Miss Eleanor, the daughter, standing by the window, her back to him. She had been unusually quiet since his arrival, and yet he could feel her eyes on him, watching him carefully. Her hands were still, but there was a tremor in her fingers, a subtle but unmistakable sign of anxiety. Was it fear? Or was it something else? Poirot's gaze shifted back to the room as he stood up, taking in the scene again. No one had entered or left the room, yet somehow the very air felt disturbed, unsettled. The windows were still ajar, the rain gently lashing against the panes, but there was something disconcerting about the way the wind seemed to brush past them. He stepped to the window, peering outside, but the view offered no clues, just the dark expanse of the night, interrupted only by the silhouette of trees swaying in the breeze. It was a stormy evening, but nothing that should have left such an oppressive weight in the air. Poirot turned back to the family, his brow furrowing slightly. He could feel the eyes of the witnesses on him, waiting for his next move, their expression shifting from unease to confusion as they realized he was not immediately offering any answers. Instead, he took his time, examining the details, so many details that seemed insignificant at first glance. His eyes flicked to the fireplace, where the low embers cast a faint glow over the room. A slight draught moved the curtains at the far end. The floor was free of footprints, except for a few faint marks near the door. It seemed that no one had entered from the hallway since the body had been discovered. But there was something off. And then he saw it. A small, inconspicuous object had been placed near the hearth, so subtly, in fact, that it could easily have been overlooked. It was a scrap of paper, carefully folded, as though someone had tried to hide it. Poirot walked over to it, bending down to retrieve it with a gloved hand. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and had been crumpled at one corner. With deliberate precision he unfolded it, revealing a series of symbols that seemed to match those on the silver mask. But there was more. Scrawled hastily beneath the symbols was a single word: doomed. Poirot's lips curled into a small smile, the first hint of satisfaction in his expression. He had found the first piece of the puzzle, though it was still far from enough. The symbols on the paper mirrored those on the mask, an interesting coincidence, but one that demanded deeper examination. This clue was too specific, too intentional to be overlooked.
Someone had gone to great lengths to leave it in such a hidden spot, knowing full well that a keen eye would find it. But why? He straightened and looked around the room once more,
his gaze falling upon Sir Thomas Carroway. The man's face had gone even paler than before, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Was it the crime that unnerved him or something else? Poirot took a deliberate step toward him, noting the way Sir Thomas stiffened in response. "Sir Thomas," Poirot began, his voice even but sharp, "tell me, what do you know about this mask?" The question was simple, but it struck a nerve. Sir Thomas faltered, his eyes flicking nervously to the silver mask still clutched in Lord Dunsford's hand. I know nothing, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice too quick, too defensive. "It's just a family heirloom, surely. There's nothing unusual about it." Poirot tilted his head, considering the man's words. The reaction was telling. Something in Sir Thomas's voice had shifted, a subtle shift that Poirot's trained ear had detected. A lie buried beneath layers of truth. It was a small clue, but one that spoke volumes. Poirot glanced back at the rest of the room. He had gathered much from their faces, but he knew there was more. The real story was hidden beneath layers of deceit, and each of these individuals had a part to play. But what was it? The scrap of paper, the strange reaction of Sir Thomas, the haunting symbols, they were all interconnected, but the full picture was still unclear. The puzzle was slowly coming together, piece by piece, and Poirot had only just begun to understand its full depth. The silver mask, the cryptic message, the tensions in the room. Each element was more than just a clue. They were the key to unlocking the truth, if only he could decipher it before another life was lost. Poirot gathered the family members in the drawing room, the tension thickening with each passing moment. He had already picked up on subtle inconsistencies in their stories, small threads of deception that wove a larger tapestry of uncertainty. Each person had their own version of events, each version at odds with the others in ways that suggested a carefully orchestrated web of lies. The detective's mind was alight with possibilities, each contradictory statement adding to the growing suspicion that the truth was buried beneath layers of misdirection and fear. He began with Sir Thomas Carroway, who still stood in the corner of the room, nervously tapping his fingers against his thigh. Poirot's eyes lingered on the man for a moment longer than necessary, noting the slight sheen of sweat on his brow and the nervous shifting of his feet. Sir Thomas was not comfortable, and it had little to do with the tragedy that had unfolded in front of him. "Sir Thomas, I wish to hear your version of events," Poirot said calmly, fixing the man with an unwavering gaze. Sir Thomas cleared his throat, his fingers twitching as he spoke. "Well, as I told the constable, I was in the library when I heard the noise, a crash, like a door slamming shut or perhaps something falling. I immediately came to investigate, but when I reached the hallway, the door to Lord Dunsford's study was locked. I tried to open it, but it was no use. By the time I managed to break the door open, it was too late. Lord Dunsford was already dead." His voice wavered on the last word, but he quickly recovered, clearing his throat. Again, Poirot raised an eyebrow. "A door that was locked from the inside. You attempted to open it yourself?" "Of course," Sir Thomas replied, his voice gaining strength. "I thought perhaps my lord had locked himself in after a quarrel. It wasn't uncommon for him to do so when he needed solitude." The detective nodded thoughtfully, letting the man's words sink in. There was something in his tone, an eagerness, almost an urgency, that made Poirot suspicious. The phrasing was too rehearsed, as though Sir Thomas had been preparing for this moment for far too long. There was a sense of calculation behind his words, a deliberate attempt to avoid any implication of guilt. Poirot filed that away in his mind, then turned his attention to Miss Eleanor, who stood by the window, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "Miss Eleanor, your turn." "What did you see?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her face pale but composed. She had not seemed particularly distressed by her father's death, nor had she reacted with the kind of grief one might expect from a daughter in such a situation. Her eyes were distant, as though she were trying to recall a memory that was just out of reach. "I was in the sitting room reading," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't hear anything unusual at first. But then, when I heard the commotion outside, I went to the hallway. I was not the first to arrive. Sir Thomas was already there, attempting to open the door. I stood back, watching. He didn't say anything at first. I could see the look on his face." Poirot leaned in slightly, sensing that this was the moment where a deeper truth might emerge. "A look?" he asked, his tone casual but insistent. "Yes," she continued, her voice steadying. "A look of guilt. It was fleeting, but it was there. He was trying to hide it, but I saw it." Poirot's eyes flickered towards Sir Thomas, who visibly tensed. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists. For a moment the tension in the room became palpable, thick with the weight of unspoken accusations. "And you did not hear a sound before the door was opened?" Poirot pressed, focusing back on Eleanor. "No," she answered quickly, almost too quickly. "I didn't hear anything. Not until I went to the hallway." Poirot allowed the silence to hang in the air for a few moments, considering her words. The contradiction was clear. She had claimed earlier not to have heard anything, yet had made a point to mention the commotion outside. Which was it? Had she heard something, or had she not? The detective could not help but note the hesitation in her voice. She was hiding something, but what? Before he could press further, Lady Margaret, who had been standing quietly near the fireplace, stepped forward. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice trembling just slightly, "I must admit, I'm not sure what I can add. I was in my chambers when I heard the noise. I immediately rushed to the door to see what had happened, but by then the door was already locked." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "You were in your chambers, you say, and you heard the noise before. You arrived at the door?" "Yes, I heard it," Lady Margaret insisted. "It was a loud crash, as though something heavy had fallen or broken. I thought it was Lord Dunsford, perhaps having another of his fits." She faltered for a moment, glancing at Sir Thomas for reassurance. "A fit?" Poirot repeated, his voice laced with curiosity. Lord Dunsford had fits? Lady Margaret seemed to hesitate before nodding. "Yes. On occasion. Stress, you know, from the estate's financial troubles. I thought it was nothing more than that." Poirot could see her unease. There was something in her voice that was too quick, too rehearsed. Her explanation felt off, as though she was desperately trying to steer the conversation in a direction that would absolve her of suspicion, but Poirot knew better than to let such a small detail slide. He turned his gaze to the final figure in the room, young Charles, the family's younger cousin, who had been unusually quiet since the beginning of the investigation. Charles stood near the window, his arms crossed in a manner that suggested impatience or frustration. His gaze was fixed on the floor, but there was a nervousness in the way his foot tapped rhythmically against the floorboards. "Charles," Poirot said, drawing his attention. "What is your story?" Charles looked up sharply, his eyes flashing with something: anger, fear. It was hard to say. "I wasn't in the house when it happened," he said quickly, his voice defensive. "I was out with friends. When I returned, I heard the commotion and came in. By the time I arrived, the door was locked and I had no idea what was going on." Poirot studied him carefully. His quick response was too rehearsed, too defensive. The young man's posture was too stiff, his movements too deliberate. There was an air of impatience about him, as though he couldn't wait to be done with this conversation. "Out with friends?" Poirot asked, his voice light, almost casual. "Can anyone vouch for your whereabouts?" Charles hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "No, I don't think anyone saw me. I was—" He faltered again, his words trailing off. Poirot pressed no further, but he had already noted the gap in Charles' alibi. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to shift into place, but the gaps between them were still too wide, the motivations too unclear. The contradictions were multiplying. Everyone had a different story, each one presenting a different version of the truth. Some seemed too eager to cooperate, others held back. And amidst the conflicting narratives, Poirot could sense a deeper deception lurking, one that none of them had fully anticipated. It was becoming clear that someone in this room was hiding something far more dangerous than a simple crime of passion. The mask, the symbols, the lies, the connections were forming, and Poirot knew the truth was not as distant as it seemed. But the question remained: who among them was truly guilty, and who was merely playing their part in a far darker game? Poirot sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his lips as he mulled over the tangled web of motives. Each individual in the room had a reason, an incentive, a desire, a fear that could lead them to murder, but no single theory provided a clean explanation. Greed, revenge, jealousy, and fear swirled in the air like smoke, creating a murky haze that made it nearly impossible to separate truth from fiction. It was clear that this was not a simple crime of passion. No, this was a carefully calculated act, and the hands behind it had hidden their motives well. He began with Sir Thomas Carraway. The man's behavior had been erratic since the first moment Poirot had set eyes on him. His nervousness, his eagerness to explain every detail of the crime, his attempt to place blame elsewhere, these were all signs of someone trying too hard to cover their tracks. And yet Sir Thomas had made an interesting point during his questioning. Lord Dunsford had been a man of financial troubles, a man whose estate was on the brink of collapse. Was it possible that Sir Thomas, desperate to maintain his own position of wealth and influence, had been willing to do whatever it took to secure his future? It was plausible, but there was one detail that didn't fit. Sir Thomas had been in the library when the crime occurred. It would have been too difficult for him to reach Lord Dunsford's study in time to carry out the murder without anyone noticing. No, the motive was there, but the opportunity was lacking. Poirot shifted his attention to Miss Eleanor, whose version of events seemed less than entirely truthful. The contradiction in her account had been glaring. She claimed not to have heard anything until the commotion outside, yet she had mentioned hearing the sound of the crash. Was she hiding something? It was possible that she had been involved in a secret conflict with her father, one that might have escalated into something violent. Eleanor was young, and the pressures of a crumbling family legacy might have been enough to drive her to desperate measures. And yet, her hesitation during the questioning had suggested a woman struggling with her own guilt. Was it fear of being caught or something else entirely? Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her involvement than met the eye. Perhaps she had been complicit, but the idea of direct involvement didn't seem to align with her character. Lady Margaret, too, seemed to be hiding something. Her claim that she thought Lord Dunsford had simply had one of his fits was an easy explanation, one that could absolve her from any responsibility. But Poirot knew that the woman's concern for her husband's well-being was not as genuine as it appeared. She had been too quick to offer up that explanation, too eager to suggest a benign cause for his death. And what of her relationship with Sir Thomas? The two of them had been alone in the house together for some time. Could their relationship have been more than just that of a brother-in-law and sister-in-law? There were whispers in the town about the Dunsford estate's financial troubles, and Lady Margaret, as the matriarch of the family, would have been keenly aware of the stakes. If there was a financial motive to be had, perhaps she and Sir Thomas had conspired to rid themselves of Lord Dunsford, ensuring their access to the family fortune. Yet again, there was a flaw in this theory. Lady Margaret had been in her chambers, and she could not have been the one to lock the door to Lord Dunsford's study from the inside. And then there was Charles. The young man had been noticeably defensive when questioned, which immediately raised Poirot's suspicions. His alibi, "I was out with friends," was flimsy at best, and he had been far too quick to deny any involvement. What was he hiding? Could it be that Charles, feeling overlooked or resentful of his position in the family, had decided to take matters into his own hands? Lord Dunsford had never been particularly kind to his younger cousin, and perhaps Charles had grown tired of being treated as little more than a nuisance. Poirot had noted the young man's anxiety during the questioning, and it had seemed to him that Charles had been less interested in defending his innocence and more interested in distancing himself from the rest of the family. But again, the timing didn't fit. Charles was out with friends when the crime occurred, and while his alibi couldn't be completely verified, there was no concrete evidence that he had been present at the scene of the crime. It was all a mess of conflicting motivations. Each person had something to gain, but no single theory could explain every aspect of the crime. As Poirot sat there, piecing together the clues in his mind, he began to see the outlines of something darker, more insidious. The motive for murder, he realized, wasn't rooted in a single desire. It was a combination of several, all converging at once. Greed, yes, but also jealousy, a need for control, and a fear of losing everything. He thought back to the peculiar clue, the silver mask. It had seemed like an odd, almost irrelevant detail at first, but now it was starting to make sense. The mask wasn't just a strange object. It was a symbol of something the killer was trying to conceal. In fact, Poirot began to suspect that the mask had been left behind on purpose, a deliberate act meant to mislead the investigation. But why? Was the killer trying to point the finger at someone else? Or was it an attempt to convey a message? What did the mask represent? The detective leaned forward in his chair, his mind working furiously. He needed to piece together the timeline, to see who had the most to gain and who had the most to hide. The lies were starting to fall apart, and each of the suspects had a thread that Poirot could pull on. He had to figure out who had the strongest motive, and who had the opportunity to make the mask and the murder fit together in this tangled web. The walls of the study seemed to close in on Poirot as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Greed, fear, revenge, They were all there, woven into the fabric of this crime. But it was more than that. Someone had been planning this for a long time, and the killer had thought they could get away with it. But Poirot had already seen through their lies, and the truth was within his grasp. He knew the game had only just begun, and the final act was yet to unfold. Poirot stood in the dimly lit room, eyes narrowing as the latest piece of evidence was laid before him. A letter found in the pocket of Sir Thomas Carroway's coat. The handwriting was unmistakable, and the contents left little room for doubt. It was a demand for money, a direct threat from Lord Dunsford to his brother-in-law, warning that the estate's financial collapse would lead to severe consequences unless a large sum of money was paid to settle the debts. Sir Thomas had been cornered, it seemed, and the letter made it clear that he had much to lose. The authorities, eager for closure, jumped to the conclusion that this was the breakthrough they needed. It appeared to confirm Sir Thomas's involvement in the crime, and the case, they declared, was solved. Yet, for Poirot, something didn't sit right. The letter, though damning, felt too convenient, too perfectly timed. If Sir Thomas had been truly desperate, why would he leave such an obvious clue behind? And more importantly, why had the crime been so meticulously staged, with such care taken to mislead the authorities? The locked door, the silver mask, the carefully executed alibis. It all pointed to a deeper, more intricate plan. And Sir Thomas, despite his financial woes, did not strike Poirot as the type to act with such calculated boldness. Poirot turned the letter over in his hands, inspecting it again. It seemed to be in order. The ink smudged slightly where it had been hastily written, but it did little to reveal the deeper truth. His mind churned with the possibility that this was nothing more than a trap meant to redirect suspicion away from the real criminal. He stepped outside, the cool evening air pressing against his skin as he pondered the developments. The authorities, caught up in the excitement of the breakthrough, were already preparing to make an arrest. Sir Thomas had been summoned to the local station, and the press was beginning to stir, eager to report the apparent resolution of the case. Yet Poirot remained unmoved. Something about the whole scenario felt too neat, too staged. He made his way back to the estate, his steps slow but deliberate. As he passed the now quiet garden, his thoughts returned to the silver mask, the most puzzling element of the crime. What did it mean? Was it merely a distraction, or was it a clue left by the killer, someone who wanted the investigation to follow the wrong path? It had seemed so out of place at first, but now it appeared to be a deliberate piece of misdirection, perhaps placed in the room to lead the authorities down a false trail. Poirot had seen such tricks before, but the question remained: who was behind it? As Poirot entered the drawing room, his eyes instinctively went to the spot where the mask had been discovered. He studied it once more, the gleaming surface reflecting the faint light from the chandelier above. A symbol, yes, but a symbol of what? The answer eluded him, but one thing was certain. This crime was far from over. The killer was still in the shadows, waiting, watching. That night, the authorities gathered at the estate, eager to hear the news of Sir Thomas's impending arrest. They were already discussing the best way to handle the public announcement, and for a moment it seemed as though the case would be closed without question. But Poirot's mind raced, his suspicions growing with each passing minute. He could not ignore the feeling that the truth had been obscured, that they had been led down a path that only the real murderer could have anticipated. He waited until the others were distracted, their attention focused on their plans for the announcement. Then, quietly, he slipped out of the room and made his way to the study once more. The door creaked open as he entered, his footsteps light against the polished floor. He approached the desk where the silver mask had been found and examined the area more closely, his eyes scanning for anything that might have been overlooked. It was then that he noticed it, a slight shift in the corner of the room, where the curtains barely moved with the breeze, a small, almost imperceptible indentation in the floor near the bookshelf. It was as though someone had been there recently, standing in that exact spot, perhaps trying to avoid detection. Poirot's gaze sharpened as he knelt down to inspect it further. There, almost hidden from view, was a faint trail of dust, disturbed by the slightest of movements. He followed the trail, his heart quickening as he approached the back wall of the study. His fingers brushed against the surface, pressing gently as he searched for any hidden compartments or objects. A faint click echoed in the stillness of the room, and Poirot's pulse quickened. He pushed against the wall once more, and a small panel slowly slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped carefully in velvet cloth, was a second, silver mask, an exact replica of the one found at the crime scene. Poirot's mind raced as he realized the implication. The killer had not been careless after all. They had been meticulous, leaving behind the first mask as a decoy. The second mask, hidden and well-guarded, had been the true clue all along, a sign that this was not just a crime of passion, but a calculated act of deception. The real criminal had wanted the authorities to focus on the obvious: Sir Thomas, the financial troubles, the letter. They had planted a piece of false evidence to lead the investigation astray, and in the chaos of the apparent breakthrough, they had hoped to escape. But Poirot had seen through it all. The silver mask was more than just a symbol. It was the key to understanding the crime. But why leave it behind, and why now? Poirot's eyes narrowed as the pieces of the puzzle began to shift into place. The false victory was clear. Sir Thomas, despite his apparent guilt, was merely a pawn in a much larger game. The killer, ever clever, had used the authorities' eagerness to close the case to their advantage. But the question remained: who had orchestrated it all, and what had they hoped to achieve? Poirot stood in the silent study, his mind racing. The authorities were closing in on their suspect, but the real criminal was still waiting, hidden in plain sight. The investigation was far from over. The mask, it seemed, had been only the beginning. Poirot sat at the desk, the second silver mask resting in front of him like a piece of the puzzle that had been waiting for him to discover. He had been right about one thing. The case was far from over. The mask had led him to this moment, but it was not just the mask that demanded his attention. There was something deeper, something older, that he couldn't shake from his mind. A lingering thought, an elusive detail that had been floating in his consciousness, refusing to settle into clarity. It was only now, with the mask in his hand, that it began to take form. He rose from the desk and moved to the bookshelf, his fingers trailing along the spines of the books, searching for something that might confirm his suspicions. The room felt heavier now, as though the walls themselves were holding secrets that had been buried for far too long. Poirot's gaze fixed on one particular book, an old leather-bound volume, its title worn with age. He pulled it from the shelf, flipping through the yellowed pages until he found what he was looking for, a reference to an unsolved case from 20 years ago. It was a strange coincidence, the connection he felt between this old case and the current investigation. The details were sketchy, the facts incomplete, but something about the names involved struck a chord. He read the passage again, narrowing his eyes as he made the connection that had eluded him before. The case had been abandoned, filed away as unsolvable. But the names in that case were not unfamiliar. Sir Thomas Carroway, Lord Dunsford, and another figure, one whose name had faded from memory, were all linked to a financial scandal that had rocked the city 2 decades ago. A scandal that had been conveniently swept under the rug, its full story never reaching the light of day. Poirot's fingers tightened around the book, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together. The silver masks, the threats, the hidden compartments, it was all too perfect. The current crime wasn't just about the present. It had roots that stretched deep into the past, into a time when the suspects had crossed paths before, when grudges had been formed and secrets had been buried. The motive for this crime, it seemed, was not merely financial or personal. It was driven by something older, something that had festered in the shadows for years. Poirot returned to the drawing room, his mind racing. He needed to speak to the witnesses once more, to those who had been too eager to offer explanations, too quick to point fingers. He needed to understand the connections between them, to unravel the threads that had been woven together over the years. But there was something else, something that had been bothering him since the beginning. The strange behavior of Lady Eleanor, Sir Thomas's wife. She had been calm, composed even during the investigation, but there was a flicker of something beneath the surface that Poirot could not ignore. Was she hiding something, or was she simply a pawn in a much larger game? Poirot called for Lady Eleanor to join him in the study, and as she entered, he noticed the tension in her posture, the way she held herself rigidly, as though she were trying to suppress some deep emotion. She sat across from him, her eyes meeting his. But there was no warmth there, no sign of the vulnerability that Poirot had expected. Instead, there was an unsettling coldness, a detachment that sent a shiver down his spine. "Lady Eleanor," Poirot began, his voice calm but probing, "I must ask you about something. You see, I have discovered something about your husband's past, a certain connection that links him to a long-forgotten case. I wonder if you might know anything about it." She stiffened at his words, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, Poirot thought she might deny everything, but instead she hesitated, as though weighing her options. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured. "I have no knowledge of what you speak of, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "My husband's affairs are his own, and I am not involved in the matters of his business. I assure you I know nothing about any old case or scandal." Poirot leaned forward, studying her carefully. He could see the faint tremor in her hands, the way she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. There was a lie buried in her words, and Poirot could hear it, like a soft murmur beneath the surface. "Lady Eleanor," Poirot said, his tone gentle but insistent, "I believe you are withholding the truth. You have lived with Sir Thomas for many years, and yet you claim no knowledge of his past. There is more to this story than you are telling." Her expression flickered, and for a moment Poirot saw a brief flash of emotion, fear, perhaps, or guilt, before it was quickly masked. She sat straighter, her eyes meeting his once more. "I have told you all I know, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, her voice cold and distant. "If you think that my husband is involved in this crime, you are mistaken. He is innocent, and I will not stand here and let you accuse him without proof." Poirot watched her carefully, his mind racing as he considered her words. She was lying. Of that he was certain. But why? What was she trying to protect? And why was she so defensive? About Sir Thomas, especially when the evidence seemed to point in his direction. As she stood to leave, Poirot's eyes followed her, noting the way she moved, the way she carefully avoided meeting his gaze. There was something else, something she was trying to hide. He needed to find out what it was. Later that evening, Poirot sat alone in the study, the book open in front of him once more. The connections between the suspects, the long-forgotten case, and the present crime were becoming clearer by the minute. He could see the shadows of the past rising up, revealing a tangled web of deceit and betrayal. Sir Thomas, Lady Eleanor, Lord Dunsford, all of them were tied to a history they had tried to bury. But now that history had resurfaced, and it was threatening to expose the truth. Poirot knew that the next step in the investigation was crucial. He needed to confront the suspects, to dig deeper into their pasts and unravel the hidden connections that had led to this moment. The crime was not just a result of greed or jealousy. It was a manifestation of something far darker, a long-standing grudge that had come to fruition in the most unexpected of ways. The truth, Poirot was certain, lay buried in the shadows of the past, and it was only a matter of time before it all came to light. The night had settled over the estate like a heavy blanket, and Poirot knew that time was slipping away. He had gathered enough pieces of the puzzle, but they were still scattered, needing to be aligned, re-examined. The small truths, the nuances, the hidden emotions, all these fragments danced just out of reach. He needed to apply a different method, something unexpected to cut through the web of lies, to reveal the truth that lay concealed beneath the polished facades. He sat in his study, staring at the array of objects in front of him. A few seemingly innocuous items, letters, the silver mask, and a collection of old photographs, lay scattered across the table. The pieces were familiar now, their significance slowly unraveling as he pieced together the story of betrayal, revenge, and forgotten grudges. Still, it wasn't enough. Poirot's gaze drifted to the window, where the moonlight painted shadows on the floor. He had to think differently. Lady Eleanor had said too much, and too little. Sir Thomas had been protective, defensive almost, and yet his alibi, impeccable on the surface, still didn't sit right with Poirot. Lord Dunsford had his own mysterious motives, but his connection to the others seemed incidental, a side note, in the tangled web that Poirot could feel growing thicker with every passing hour. The inconsistencies were there. The puzzle was almost complete, but he needed to test the pieces one final time. Poirot stood, his thoughts coming together with swift clarity. He needed to take a risk, to create a situation where the suspects would act without the luxury of preparation, where their true reactions could be seen. It was time to turn the investigation into a game, a controlled experiment. He arranged for a small gathering in the drawing room, one that would be simple, almost mundane, but carefully constructed. The idea was to throw the suspects off balance, to watch their reactions, to see if any subtle clues emerged. A psychological game of sorts. Lady Eleanor, Sir Thomas, and Lord Dunsford were all present, along with a few others from the household. Poirot had asked them to sit, to discuss the details of the case in the most casual way, pretending to consider their involvement in a light, almost friendly manner. He spoke to them about the mask, the alleged clue that had been discovered, asking for their thoughts on the matter. His tone was relaxed, as though it were a simple conversation over tea. "I have been thinking," Poirot said with a deliberate calm, his fingers lightly tapping the side of his chair, "that perhaps the answer lies not in the immediate circumstances, but in the way the crime has unfolded, how the evidence came to light, and why some of you seem so eager to help me uncover the truth." He watched them closely, gauging their reactions. Lord Dunsford shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, but his expression remained composed. Lady Eleanor, however, seemed unsettled. Her hands, neatly folded in her lap, trembled for the briefest moment. Her composure faltered just enough for Poirot to catch it, a fleeting crack in her flawless exterior. Sir Thomas, on the other hand, was quiet, his jaw tense, as though he were calculating every word. "I believe," Poirot continued, "that we must examine all possibilities, even those that seem unlikely at first." He paused, allowing the silence to hang for a beat longer than comfortable. "What if someone among us is hiding something more than just an affair? What if there is a much deeper connection between this crime and the past?" He allowed the words to linger, watching carefully for the responses. Lord Dunsford spoke first, as expected, with his usual air of authority, dismissing Poirot's suggestion with practiced ease. But it was Lady Eleanor who caught his attention. There was a flash of something in her eyes, something defensive yet almost pleading. "Surely, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice tight, "you don't believe that any of us would have anything to do with such an act? We are not criminals." Her words were carefully chosen, but the slight stammer in her voice, the way she adjusted her posture, gave away a hint of the anxiety that had started to simmer beneath the surface. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Are you certain, Lady Eleanor?" he asked softly, a touch of insinuation in his tone. "Certain that your past and present have no connection to this tragedy?" She flinched, just barely. It was enough. Poirot took a moment, his gaze flicking over the others in the room. He could feel the tension thickening, the small threads of suspicion tightening around Lady Eleanor. He had to push further, to provoke just enough of a reaction to reveal the cracks in her carefully constructed persona. "Perhaps it is not a single individual," Poirot mused aloud, half to himself. "Perhaps the answer lies in the relationships that we share, the hidden allegiances, the shared secrets that no one speaks of. What if someone among us knows too much, has seen too much?" There it was, an even sharper tremor in Lady Eleanor's hands now, a slight tremor in her voice as she quickly interjected, "That is quite enough, Monsieur Poirot. I cannot continue this conversation." It was in that moment that Poirot knew. Lady Eleanor had just made her mistake. The attempt to shut him down, to shut the conversation down altogether, it was a defensive move. She had reacted too quickly, her composure slipping as she scrambled to control the conversation. It was in the way she had tried to divert attention from herself, the way she had, so subtly, closed off the conversation when the past had been mentioned. Poirot's mind raced, tracing the pattern back to the old case, to the financial scandal. He could almost see the pieces falling into place. Lady Eleanor was hiding something, a connection to the crime that was more personal, more entangled than anyone could have guessed. Her reaction, her desperate attempt to silence the conversation, these were not the signs of someone innocent. As he looked at her, the final piece clicked into place. The truth was not just buried in the past, it had been staring him in the face all along. Now he just had to confirm it, and for that, he would need to dig deeper, deeper than he ever thought he would have to go. But he had her now, and there was no turning back. Poirot sat in the stillness of his study, the pieces of the case now laying themselves out in front of him like a complex, twisted tapestry. Lady Eleanor's reaction had been the key, the subtle slip of her composure signaling a deeper involvement. He had been right to focus on her, right to press her on the connections that ran deeper than anyone had suspected. But there was still more to uncover, and time was running out. The night had fallen silent, save for the occasional crack of the fire crackling in the hearth. The tension in the house was palpable, each moment feeling like a stretched wire ready to snap. Poirot had arranged to meet with his key witnesses the following morning to dig deeper, to press for answers. But something felt off. He had the nagging sense that the truth was being obscured, hidden just beyond his reach. It wasn't until he received the news that everything changed. The young constable arrived in a hurry, his face pale with urgency. Poirot knew instantly that something had gone terribly wrong. As the constable spoke, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with crushing force. "The photograph, Monsieur Poirot," the constable said, breathless. "The one with the missing figure. It's gone, vanished. There's no trace of it." Poirot's mind raced, the cold realization settling over him like ice. The photograph, one of the few remaining pieces of evidence that linked Lady Eleanor to the tragic events unfolding, had disappeared. No one had seen it leave. No one could explain how or why it was suddenly gone. The implications were clear. Someone had deliberately removed it. Someone who knew the weight of its significance. Someone who was desperately trying to prevent the detective from uncovering the truth. "Tell me everything," Poirot said, his voice low, controlled. "Who had access to the room? Who was present when it was last seen?" The constable hesitated, but only for a moment. "The photograph was in the study on your desk. We all assumed it was safe there, that you were still working on it. But now it's just gone. We've checked every room, every corner, but it's vanished without a trace." Poirot's gaze hardened, his mind calculating rapidly. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was deliberate. The photograph wasn't just any piece of evidence. It was a crucial thread that connected Lady Eleanor to the past. A past she clearly wanted to keep buried. Someone had gotten to it before he could, and that someone had made their move while the detective's attention was focused elsewhere. As the constable left to continue the search, Poirot sat back in his chair, his thoughts running in tight circles. The photograph was not just an image, it was a symbol. It had held the key to unraveling the conspiracy, the quiet but devastating truth about the connections between the suspects. Now, with that piece gone, the investigation had taken a darker turn. Poirot's mind flickered back to Lady Eleanor's reaction. She had been too eager to shut him down, too eager to dismiss the possibility of a link between her and the past. The photograph had been the only piece that could definitively place her at the center of the web, but now it was gone, and with it, the last piece of her innocence. But Poirot would not be so easily deterred. He had known from the beginning that This case would be filled with obstacles, that the truth would not be handed to him on a silver platter. The moment the evidence began to disappear, he knew that someone was actively working against him. Someone who had been watching his every move, waiting for the precise moment to strike. The stakes had just escalated. What had once been a tangled web of deceit was now a full-fledged conspiracy, and Poirot was the only one who could expose it. The next few hours passed in a blur. Poirot meticulously examined every detail, his mind whirring with calculations. The constable had continued the search, but the photograph remained elusive. The sudden disappearance had left everyone shaken, and with it, the trust that had started to form between the detective and the household began to crack. The people closest to him, those who had initially seemed innocent enough, now seemed more and more like potential suspects. Could someone in the house have removed the photograph? Or had it been a stranger, someone connected to the case in a way they hadn't yet realized? Poirot's thoughts returned to the suspects. Lady Eleanor, of course, was at the forefront. She had the most to lose from the discovery of that photograph. But there were others who also had their own reasons to hide the truth. Sir Thomas had been so protective of her, so adamantly convinced of her innocence. Was he simply trying to protect her from the fallout of a crime that went deeper than either of them realized? Or was his involvement more than just loyalty? And then there was Lord Dunsford, whose own secrets seemed to bleed into the case in subtle, unexpected ways. Could he have been behind the theft? Had he known the photograph's importance before Poirot had even uncovered it? Poirot paced back and forth in the study, each step measured and deliberate. He needed to regain control of the investigation. The photograph was gone, but that didn't mean the case was over. If anything, the disappearance had only served to strengthen his resolve. The pieces that had seemed to fall into place now seemed even more disjointed, but there was a pattern. He could feel it, just out of reach. The false fronts were beginning to crumble, and the players were revealing themselves for what they truly were. The trust that had once existed between Poirot and the household was gone. Now, suspicion clouded every interaction, every word spoken. The true enemy was hidden in plain sight, working to keep the detective from the one thing that could destroy their carefully constructed lies. But Poirot was not one to be so easily deterred. He would find the photograph, or he would uncover something even more damning. Either way, he was getting closer. And as the night stretched on, with each new revelation pulling him deeper into the shadows, Poirot knew one thing for certain: the game had changed. The stakes had risen, and the truth, once so close, now seemed to dance just out of reach. But he would find it, no matter what it took. Poirot had spent the entire night poring over every scrap of evidence, trying to piece together the puzzle. That seemed to shift before his eyes with each new discovery. He had been confident that the vanishing photograph would be the breaking point, the final push toward uncovering the criminal behind the chaos. Yet as the hours dragged on, it became clear that the picture was far more intricate and dangerous than he had initially believed. The house had quieted, the storm of whispers and uncertainty temporarily subdued, as Poirot sat in his study, his mind racing with possibilities. The connection between the suspects was murky, but there was one undeniable truth. Someone was working tirelessly to undermine him, to cloud the investigation with misdirection and lies. He had to remain sharp, for every step forward seemed to push him 2 steps back. Just as he was about to pick up the phone to speak with his trusted constable, about the search for the missing photograph, a knock echoed at the door. Poirot's heart skipped a beat as he rose to answer, his instinct telling him that this was no ordinary visitor. The young constable entered, looking unusually tense. His hands were trembling as he handed Poirot a sealed letter. "There's been an incident, Monsieur Poirot," the constable said, his voice strained. "Another murder." Poirot froze, his heart thudding against his chest. He unfolded the letter with careful precision, the words scrawled across the paper confirming the nightmare. It was Lady Eleanor. She had been found dead, her body in the garden, her life snuffed out in an eerily similar manner to the first victim. The circumstances were all too familiar, but this time there was no denying it. The game had taken a darker turn. Poirot's mind whirled as he absorbed the information. He had been right all along. The villain was still one step ahead of him. The photograph wasn't the key. It was the person who had stolen it, who had planned every move with a meticulousness that was almost unnatural. He couldn't afford to waste a moment. The delicate balance of suspicion that had hung over the house was now shattered, replaced by raw fear. Someone was hunting them all, and no one was safe, not even him. Poirot's thoughts snapped back to the first murder. The initial investigation had pointed in one direction, but now he realized how little he truly knew. The second crime proved that the motives were deeper, more complex, and far more dangerous than he had anticipated. There was more at play here than a simple act of revenge or greed. It was as if a web of lies had been spun, connecting the victims in ways that only the killer understood. Without a word, Poirot turned on his heel and headed toward the door, his mind already calculating the next steps. The constable, though visibly shaken, followed him with urgency. The house was a maze of secrets, but Poirot's sharp eyes saw everything. Every gesture, every pause, every quiver of a lip, it all mattered. It all told him more than words ever could. When they reached the garden, Poirot didn't need to look long to understand the gravity of the situation. Lady Eleanor's body was positioned carefully, almost deliberately. There was something off about the way she had been placed, as if the killer had wanted her to be discovered in a certain way. The body had been left at the base of an ancient oak tree, her eyes wide open, staring toward the house as if pleading for something, or warning of something yet to come. Poirot crouched beside her, inspecting the scene with his usual calm precision. There were no signs of struggle, no immediate indications of how she had been killed, but he could feel the weight of her death settling into the very ground beneath them. It was clear that whoever was behind this had planned it carefully, executing each move with a ruthless sense of purpose. He rose and surveyed the surroundings. The air was heavy, saturated with the scent of earth and damp leaves. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the early morning light. And for a moment, Poirot almost felt as though the very land itself was conspiring to hide the truth. The constable, who had been standing nervously to the side, spoke up. "There's something strange about the way she's been placed. It's almost like—" "I know," Poirot interrupted, his voice firm but measured. "It is deliberate." A message. The constable blinked, taken aback by the detective's confidence. A message? But from whom? Poirot's gaze shifted back to Lady Eleanor's face, and for a brief moment he thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her expression. It was as if she knew something important, something that was just beyond his reach. But that was impossible. She had been too careful, too elusive, and now she was gone, leaving only questions in her wake. "The message is not for us, mon ami," Poirot said softly. "It is for someone else. Someone who will know exactly what this means." The constable looked around, still confused. But who would want to hurt her? And why? Poirot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle around him. He felt the pieces falling into place, but the answers were still shrouded in darkness. The killer had played their hand once again, pulling the strings of fate in a way that only they could understand. Poirot turned and walked back toward the house, his mind already racing ahead. Whoever had murdered Lady Eleanor had done so with a chilling sense of precision. There was no longer any doubt in his mind that this was a carefully orchestrated game, one in which the detective himself was the intended target. A sudden feeling of unease swept over him, and he quickened his pace. As he entered the house, the air seemed to grow thicker, the tension palpable. Poirot knew that his next move had to be calculated, measured, but he also knew that time was slipping away. The killer was still out there, waiting, watching, and ready to strike again. He was no longer just solving a crime. He was in a race against time, and the clock was ticking louder with each passing second. The game had changed, and Poirot could feel the shadow of death closing in around him. Poirot sat in his study once more, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The relentless ticking of the clock seemed to echo the rhythm of his thoughts, a constant reminder that time was slipping away. The second murder had rattled everyone, but it had also cleared a path for something deeper, something that had been lurking beneath the surface of the investigation all along. The morning's discovery of Lady Eleanor's body had sent shockwaves through the household, and yet, as Poirot mulled over the details, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the solution was slipping through his fingers, just out of reach. It wasn't until he stepped back, forcing himself to look at the investigation from a different angle, that the first glimmer of insight began to form. He had been focused too closely on the suspects, too fixated on the tangled web of motives to see the bigger picture. The house felt colder now, as if its walls were pressing in on him. His sharp eyes scanned the room, noticing every detail in its familiar surroundings: the half-empty glass of brandy on the table, the book that had been left open at the last chapter, the worn rug that had been carefully aligned. But there was something else, something that had eluded him until now. A subtle shift in the air, a crack in the perfect order of things. The investigation had been slipping, each lead becoming more convoluted, each suspect more elusive. But Poirot knew. He knew that all this chaos was part of the design. A small thing, an offhand comment from Mrs. Greaves earlier that morning, suddenly rang in his ears, breaking through the fog of uncertainty. She had mentioned something about a loose end in the garden, but the words had been spoken so casually, so dismissively, that Poirot hadn't thought twice about them. Yet now, the significance of her tone, the slight hesitation in her voice, felt like the key to understanding everything. It wasn't just the words that had been spoken, it was the way they had been said, almost as if she were trying to steer him away from something. Poirot's mind shifted gears, darting from one thought to another as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. What had seemed like random events, isolated incidents, now appeared to be part of a larger plan, one that stretched far beyond the present day and into the depths of history. The murders, the missing evidence, the photographs, the subtle tensions between the residents, all of it had been carefully orchestrated to lead him in a particular direction. He thought back to the First clue, the photograph that had vanished into thin air. What was its purpose? Why had it been so important that someone was willing to go to great lengths to steal it? Poirot knew the answer wasn't in the photograph itself. It was in what it represented, what it connected to. The key was not in the present, but in the past, where the shadows of forgotten secrets and old grudges had festered. And then it hit him, the small detail that had been staring him in the face all along. The misplaced object in the study, a seemingly insignificant trinket that had been left behind. He recalled Mrs. Greaves's nervousness when she had come to him, offering a piece of information that seemed to be an afterthought. The trinket had belonged to Lady Eleanor, a gift from a long-lost relative. That small, innocuous object had slipped from her fingers and landed on the floor the night before the murder. It had been dismissed by everyone as irrelevant, but Poirot now saw it for what it truly was, a marker, a thread that tied the victims together. He stood up abruptly, the sudden movement disrupting the stillness of the room. The pattern was emerging, clear as day. The key to the case had always been there, right under his nose. The murders weren't random. They were connected, intertwined with a history of betrayal and revenge, one that had been buried for decades. And the trinket? It wasn't just an object. It was a reminder of something darker, something hidden in plain sight. Poirot's heart raced as he paced the room, connecting the dots faster than he had ever done before. The web of deception that had seemed so convoluted now appeared simple, even obvious. He had been looking at the wrong people, focusing too much on their motives, their alibis, their histories. The truth wasn't in the suspects. It was in the connections between them, in the invisible ties that bound them to the past. The key to the case lay not in who had committed the crimes, but in why they were being committed. He could see it now, the sequence of events that had led to this point. The photo had been stolen because it held the answer to a question no one wanted answered. The first murder had been a warning, a statement meant to silence those who knew too much. And Lady Eleanor's death was part of the same plan, a means of drawing the detective deeper into the web, of forcing him to uncover the truth before it was too late. Poirot stopped mid-step, his gaze fixed on the wall as his mind worked at a fever pitch. The connection between the victims, the photograph, the trinket, the family secrets, was more than just coincidence. There was a pattern, a rhythm to the killings, and it was only by understanding that pattern that he could hope to stop the killer before another victim fell. A sudden realization struck him. The murderer wasn't acting alone. Someone had been pulling the strings all along, someone who had carefully orchestrated each step of the plan, from the first murder to the theft of the photograph. But who? And why? Poirot turned back to the desk, his hand resting on the edge as he considered the facts. The investigation had been clouded with distractions, false leads, and red herrings. But now he understood. Everything had been a deliberate move, a part of a much larger scheme. The killer had been playing a game, one with far-reaching consequences. He knew that he was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The investigation had reached a turning point, and the pattern that had seemed so elusive was now undeniable. The killer was no longer in the shadows. They had made a mistake. The next move was his, and Poirot intended to make it count. Poirot sat back in his chair, the weight of his thoughts pressing on him like a storm on the horizon. The pattern had revealed itself, but even as the pieces fell into place, he knew the most important truth was still hidden beneath the surface. The murder, the theft of the photograph, the trinket. It was all connected, but the question remained. Why? What had driven someone to commit these atrocities, to weave such a complex web of lies and death? He paced slowly, trying to untangle the threads in his mind. The obvious answers had all been exhausted. Money, revenge, and power had all seemed plausible at first, but as he considered the facts, he realized those explanations fell short of explaining the true depths of this crime. There was something darker, something more personal, lurking beneath the surface. His eyes flicked to the photograph he had found earlier, the one that had been so carefully hidden away. It wasn't just a family heirloom, a simple memento. It had been a key to the past, to a history of pain and betrayal, a history that no one wanted to remember. The killer wasn't driven by greed or jealousy. They were driven by something much more profound, a need to erase the past, to bury it so deeply that it could never resurface. And in order to do that, they had to destroy everything that tied them to it. The victims had all been connected by one thing, the dark secret they shared. Poirot's mind went back to Mrs. Greaves. Her nervousness had been more than just a reaction to the investigation. She had known more than she had let on. He had seen the flicker of recognition in her eyes when the photograph was mentioned, the way her hand had trembled as she pointed to it. She had been hiding something, and in that moment, Poirot had known she was more than just a bystander in this twisted drama. The clue had been right there, in front of him all along. The trinket, the photograph, the family secrets, and the suspicious reactions from everyone involved. It wasn't just about the inheritance or the power dynamics within the family. It was about a buried past that no one wanted to confront. The hidden motive began to reveal itself in pieces like fragments of a broken mirror that reflected something much more unsettling. The true villain, the one pulling the strings, had been scarred by something from their youth, a trauma so deep that it had driven them to erase everything in their path. Their actions weren't just about punishing those who had wronged them. They were driven by the need to forget, to wipe away the stain of a past they could never escape. Poirot's mind raced, his heart quickening as he pieced together the fragments. The psychological profile of the killer was slowly emerging, a person so consumed by their desire to escape the past that they were willing to destroy everything in their wake, including those who had been closest to them. The murders weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated, precise, and deeply personal. The killer wasn't just eliminating threats. They were trying to rewrite history, to erase the very memories that haunted them. The motive was as clear as it was shocking. It wasn't about greed, revenge, or power. It was about survival. The killer had been consumed by the need to bury their own past, to ensure that no one ever discovered the truth. And in their mind, the only way to do that was to eliminate anyone who could expose them. Poirot paused, his mind racing through the possibilities. He had seen this kind of psychological breakdown before, individuals driven by guilt, by a need to atone for something they had done long ago. But this was different. The killer wasn't seeking redemption. They were seeking erasure. They wanted the past to disappear, to be forgotten. And anyone who got too close to that secret was a threat that had to be eliminated. He had been right all along. This wasn't about money or power. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about something much deeper, something that lay buried beneath the surface of this family's history. And now, with this knowledge, Poirot understood what he had to do. He had to confront the killer, not with accusations or evidence, but with the truth. the truth that they could no longer run from. The walls of the house felt more suffocating than ever. Poirot knew the killer was watching him, waiting for the next move. But now, with the true motive exposed, he had the advantage. The game was no longer a puzzle of facts and figures. It was a psychological battle, one that would demand more than just intellect. It would require insight into the darkest corners of the human mind. Poirot took a deep breath, his fingers gently brushing the photograph that lay before him. The final pieces were falling into place. The killer's psyche, their motives, their actions, it all made sense now. But the question remained: who among the suspects was capable of such a warped, destructive desire to escape their past? Who had the strength to destroy everything, even their own family, in order to erase the sins that haunted them? The answer, Poirot knew, was waiting just around the corner, and with it, the final confrontation would come. The tension in the air was thick, each second stretching longer than the last, as Poirot stood in the drawing room, carefully observing his surroundings. The door behind him creaked, a sound that barely registered, but in the stillness of the moment, it was deafening. His mind was sharp, every detail of the investigation now laid out before him like an intricate map. He had known this moment would come, and now, with the final pieces in place, he was ready. Mrs. Greaves stood across from him, her eyes darting nervously. She had been the most unpredictable of all the suspects, her motives unclear, her actions too erratic to be dismissed. But now, with the truth finally exposed, it was time for her to confront her past, and for him to confront her, Poirot's. Voice was calm, steady as he addressed her, the weight of his words carrying a quiet finality. You see, madame, it is not simply a matter of money or revenge. The true motive behind these terrible events is something much darker, a need to erase the past, a desire to bury a truth so painful that it could not be allowed to see the light of day. Mrs. Greaves's breath caught, and she took a step back, her face pale as the realization settled over her. Poirot watched her closely, his eyes never leaving her face. He could feel the pressure mounting, the air thick with the gravity of the situation. She had been cornered, but her composure was slipping. This was it. This was the moment when everything would fall apart. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice trembling. It was the same defense she had used time and again, but Poirot could hear the cracks in her facade. She was no longer certain of her lies. You do, madame. The photograph, the trinket, the strange behavior. All of it ties back to a single buried truth. The people you've killed, the ones you've hurt, they all shared something you could not forgive. They knew what you had done, and so, in your mind, they had to die. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Mrs. Greaves' hands clenched at her sides, her breathing shallow, as if every word Poirot spoke was digging deeper into a wound she could no longer ignore. Poirot stepped closer, his presence unwavering. But you made one critical mistake, madame. You underestimated me. You thought you could erase the past by eliminating those who knew your secret. But you forgot that there are always those who will search for the truth. Her eyes flickered, and for a moment Poirot saw something else behind the mask of fear, something darker, more calculating. She wasn't just a frightened woman cornered by her own crimes. There was something more. Something cold. Do you think you can scare me, detective? She hissed, her voice low and filled with venom. You don't know anything about me. You have no idea what I've had to do to survive. Poirot's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Oh, but I do, madame. I know exactly what it is to want to bury the past, to wish for a clean slate. But there is no escape, no matter how hard you try." With that, he took another step forward, bringing himself within reach of the woman who had orchestrated so much death. "I know you. I know the lengths you've gone to keep your secret hidden, but it's over now. You cannot run from the truth anymore. Your past has finally caught up with you." Mrs. Greaves's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Poirot saw the flicker of desperation in her gaze. It was fleeting, but it was enough to confirm everything he had suspected. She knew the game was over. She had no more moves left. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, in a sudden burst of motion, Mrs. Greaves reached for something at her side. Something Poirot hadn't seen before. A knife. She lunged at him, a last desperate attempt to escape the trap she had set for herself. But Poirot was ready. He sidestepped, moving with the precise, deliberate speed that had become his trademark. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed move, disarming her in an instant. The knife clattered to the floor, and Mrs. Greaves fell to her knees, her breath ragged. The detective remained calm, his face as composed as ever as he looked down at her. "Madame, I had hoped you would choose the path of honesty, but now it seems we must continue down the road of confrontation." He didn't need to shout or raise his voice. His quiet authority was enough to make her tremble. "You will pay for what you've done," Poirot said, his voice cold and final. "Not just for the murders, but for the lives you've destroyed, the truth you've hidden for so long. It's over." Mrs. Greaves, broken now, nodded silently, her head hanging low. She knew, as Poirot did, that there was no way out. The trap had closed, and the game was done. The detective had won. As the authorities arrived to take her away, Poirot allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The case had been complex, filled with misdirection and false trails. But in the end, it was the human element, the psychology of fear, guilt, and the desire to escape, that had proven the key to solving it. He had known from the start that the truth, no matter how well hidden, would eventually come to light. And it had. With the case closed, Poirot stepped out into the quiet night, the weight of the investigation lifting from his shoulders. But as he looked out into the darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were always more secrets to uncover, more mysteries to solve. The world was never as simple as it seemed, and he would continue, as always, to seek the truth. Poirot had expected the aftermath to be a quiet one, his task complete, the mystery solved. The room was still, the only sound the occasional rustling of papers as the officers filed through their notes, preparing to finalize the case. Mrs. Greaves, now in custody, had begun to speak, the weight of her confession releasing some of the tension in the air, but still, Poirot couldn't shake a nagging feeling at the back of his mind. There was something that didn't quite fit, a shadow just beyond his grasp. And it was only when he was alone, walking the quiet streets back to his office, that he truly understood the reason why. The night was cold, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the cobblestone streets as he paced, his thoughts racing faster than his feet could carry him. The case, which had felt so simple in its resolution, now had an unsettling quality about it. Something was missing. The pieces, so neatly arranged, had gaps, small but significant gaps. He reached his office, unlocking the door with the familiar click of the key. Inside, it was just as he had left it, tidy, ordered, a space of perfect control. But the moment he crossed the threshold, his eyes were drawn to the desk, where the final piece of evidence, an old, faded letter, still sat, untouched. Poirot had read the letter early in the investigation, but it hadn't seemed important at the time. It was from a lawyer to a distant relative of Mrs. Greaves. A formality, really. But something in the wording had caught his eye. Something too offhand to be coincidental. He sat down at his desk, pulling the letter closer, reading the words once more. The more he read, the more he realized the implications were far greater than he had initially thought. The letter mentioned the name of someone who had been in the background throughout the case, a name that had seemed inconsequential, unimportant: Charles Greaves, the husband of the woman now in custody. But Poirot knew that name. Charles Greaves was not a man one could forget easily. A once prominent businessman who had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. No one had ever found his body, no one had ever asked the right questions. Until now. He put the letter down slowly, his mind beginning to form the shape of a new, disturbing possibility. Mrs. Greaves had confessed to the crimes, yes. But what if she wasn't the true mastermind? What if the key to understanding the entire case lay not in her motives, but in the connection to her husband's disappearance? And what if, just what if, Charles Greaves wasn't as dead as everyone had assumed? Poirot felt the familiar thrill of a new revelation, and it was then that he realized the case was far from over. The criminal he thought he had unmasked might have been a puppet, with someone else pulling the strings from the shadows. Mrs. Greaves had been the tool, not the architect. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft knock at the door. It was Captain Hastings, his ever-faithful companion, who had been with him through so many cases, though even Hastings could not have known just how close they were to a revelation that would turn everything upside down. "Poirot," Hastings said, his voice heavy with concern. "I've just received a strange call. It's about Greaves. About Charles Greaves. They've found something. A body, they say. And they think it's him." Poirot's pulse quickened. His suspicions, the hints that had been simmering beneath the surface, were suddenly coming into sharp focus. "Where?" he asked, his voice sharp. "At the old estate," Hastings replied. "The one he abandoned before vanishing. It's been a long time, but they've found something in the cellar. Some kind of evidence." Poirot stood immediately, his mind racing with possibilities. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The final twist. The one he hadn't anticipated. But now, in the quiet of his office, it seemed inevitable. They left the office quickly, making their way to the estate with urgency, the weight of the night pressing down on them. The once grand building loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the dark sky, like a forgotten monument to a past that had been buried. As they neared the cellar, Poirot's heart rate increased. The moment of truth was upon them. The police were already there, the scene illuminated by harsh floodlights that cast long shadows across the grounds. A few officers stood near the entrance, their faces grim. The cellar door creaked open as they approached, and Poirot could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. They descended into the cold, damp darkness of the cellar, and the sight that awaited them was enough to stop Poirot in his tracks. A body, but not the body of Charles Greaves. Instead, it was a woman who bore an eerie resemblance to Mrs. Greaves. The resemblance was so uncanny that for a moment Poirot felt the ground beneath him shift. He stepped closer, examining the face, the features. It was unmistakable. The woman had been dead for years, but she was not Charles Greaves. His mind whirled as he processed the shock of the discovery. This wasn't just a twist in the investigation. It was something far more complicated. This woman had been in the house when Greaves disappeared. This woman had been someone close to him, someone whose death had gone uninvestigated, her fate dismissed, and her connection to Mrs. Greaves. A story that needed to be uncovered. Hastings, still in the dark about the implications, looked from Poirot to the body. "Who is she?" he asked, bewildered. Poirot's voice was steady, though his mind was already spinning the threads of this new revelation. "She is the key to it all, Hastings, and she is the final piece of the puzzle. But this case is far from resolved." The truth was no longer clear-cut. The case, so neatly tied up with Mrs. Greaves's confession, had taken a sharp turn, and Poirot knew now that he had to find the final piece. The mastermind, the true criminal, was still out there, and they were far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. Poirot stood in the dim light of the cellar, the discovery of the woman's body now a cold weight in his chest. The officers had stepped back, offering him space to think, yet the answers he sought remained elusive. Hastings stood beside him, his confusion and unease palpable, but Poirot remained calm, his mind methodically sifting through the fragments of evidence, like a master piecing together an intricate puzzle. It was clear now, Charles Greaves had not just disappeared. He had orchestrated a far more elaborate scheme. But why? And how? The body of the woman in the cellar seemed to hold the key, but her identity was yet a mystery. The resemblance to Mrs. Greaves was undeniable. Too exact for coincidence, but the answers were tangled, and Poirot knew that even in the quiet darkness of this old estate, time was running out. He took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts as he addressed Hastings. "This case, mon ami, is far from finished. The true mastermind is still at large, and what we have uncovered here is only a small part of the larger scheme. You see, the woman we found, while not Charles Greaves, is connected to him. She is, in fact, the link that ties everything together." Poirot's words hung in the air like smoke, and Hastings could only look at him in silence, trying to make sense of it all. "But who is she, Poirot?" Hastings asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That is the question, Hastings." "The woman, she is the sister of Mrs. Greaves. You see, the whole truth has been hiding in plain sight. Mrs. Greaves didn't just lose her husband years ago, she lost her sister as well, and her sister didn't die of natural causes. No, Hastings, she was murdered, and Charles Greaves, he was behind it all." The realization struck Hastings like a hammer. "But why, Poirot? Why would he kill his wife's sister?" Poirot's gaze hardened as he stared down at the body. Greaves was a man driven by ambition, by control. He wanted everything: power, money, influence. His wife's inheritance was a treasure trove, but the key to securing it lay not only in her trust, but in eliminating those who might stand in his way. The woman we've found in this cellar? She was a threat. She knew too much. But Charles Greaves didn't just silence her, He created a narrative, a story, to erase her from memory, to make her disappearance seem like an accident. "But Mrs. Greaves," Hastings began. "Ah, yes. Mrs. Greaves," Poirot cut in, his voice sharp. "She was in on it, but only partially. She was blind to the full extent of his plan, believing him to be a loving husband, a devoted partner. She never knew the full truth until it was too late. By the time the woman's body was hidden, her own sister's fate was sealed. Mrs. Greaves, in her grief and shock, became a pawn, a tool in a larger, more dangerous game." Poirot paused, allowing his words to settle before he continued. "You see, Hastings, it was not just money that motivated Greaves. It was the pursuit of control. The murder of his wife's sister was just the beginning. Greaves staged his disappearance to make it look like a well-timed accident, and all the while, his wife was left to mourn a loss she couldn't truly understand." Hastings finally understood the depths of the deception. The murder of the woman in the cellar, the twisted game of power and betrayal, had all been carefully orchestrated to protect Greaves's interests. But Poirot wasn't finished yet. There was one last detail, one last piece of the puzzle. The letter we found earlier, Hastings, the one that seemed so insignificant. It was written by the lawyer who handled the woman's estate. But more importantly, it was written by the same man who had been handling Greaves's affairs after his supposed disappearance. Greaves had staged his own death, and he had orchestrated every step of the way, creating an alibi, framing a narrative, ensuring that anyone who got too close would either be silenced or distracted. "But where is Greaves now?" Hastings asked, his voice tight with urgency. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. "That is the most troubling part, mon ami. Greaves has vanished again. Perhaps he was never gone at all. We have caught only the faintest glimpse of him. I suspect he is watching us now, waiting for the moment when the final piece falls into place." The words echoed in Poirot's mind as he pieced together the final moments of the case. Mrs. Greaves was now in custody, her role in the tragedy undeniable. But the true mastermind, the one pulling all the strings, had managed to escape once more. It was maddening to think that after all the careful work, after the hours of investigation, the villain could slip through their grasp once again. Poirot looked to Hastings, his face set with determination. "We may have uncovered the truth, but justice has not been served. Greaves is still out there, and he will strike again if we do not act swiftly. The question, Hastings, is not whether we've solved the case. It is whether we can stop him before it is too late." They left the estate in silence, the weight of the unresolved mystery heavy in the air between them. Poirot knew that even with all the pieces in place, the criminal was still beyond his reach, and that knowledge gnawed at him like a bitter memory. He had done everything right, every detail accounted for, every clue carefully followed. And yet, the most dangerous criminals were always those who remained one step ahead, playing a game that only they understood. As they drove back to the station, Poirot's mind was already calculating the next move. The case was not over. Far from it. The real conclusion would come only when Charles Greaves was finally caught. But for now, there was nothing to do but wait. He had one final card to play. But until that moment came, Poirot knew that justice, though it had come close, had slipped through his fingers once again. Poirot's footsteps echoed softly on the cobblestone street as he walked away from the station, his mind swirling with the residue of the case. The satisfaction of uncovering the truth had been fleeting, quickly replaced by the gnawing certainty that something still didn't sit right. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a subtle dissonance in the symphony of facts he had painstakingly pieced together. Hastings walked beside him, silent, reflecting on the recent events, his gaze distant. The air between them was thick with unspoken thoughts. Poirot knew his friend was still processing the depth of the case. They had exposed Charles Greaves's schemes, and yet, despite their success, there was no peace in the resolution. The satisfaction of a solved mystery was short-lived when the sense of something left unfinished lingered like a shadow. Poirot stopped momentarily in front of the café, his eyes flicking back to the station in the distance. "Hastings, do you not find it strange?" he asked softly. Hastings, who had been lost in thought, turned to him. "Strange, Poirot? In what way?" "The pieces, mon ami, they fit too perfectly," Poirot mused, a touch of unease creeping into his voice. "The disappearance of Greaves, the strange timing of the woman's death, everything aligns with such precision that I cannot help but wonder if it is simply too convenient." Hastings frowned. "You mean you think there's something we missed? But we uncovered everything, Mrs. Greaves, her sister, the lawyer, the estate. It all points to Charles Greaves." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his sharp mind sifting through the events once more. It does. And yet, Hastings, there is one detail that keeps returning to me. One small thing that doesn't quite make sense." Hastings waited, sensing that Poirot was on the edge of something important. "The letter from the lawyer, the one we found in the attic," Poirot continued. "It was too direct, too clear. A letter that tied everything together with such certainty. Yet it was a letter, written in haste perhaps to explain something we would find. But it was never meant for our eyes, Hastings." "So you're suggesting it was planted?" Hastings asked, his voice lowering. "But why would Greaves or anyone want us to find it?" Poirot's eyes glinted with a quiet intensity. "That, my friend, is the question. It's almost as if someone wanted us to believe we had solved the case, wanted us to think that Charles Greaves was the man behind everything. But I wonder, Hastings, if we were meant to follow the obvious trail." "Meaning?" Hastings trailed off, his brows furrowing. "I wonder, mon ami," Poirot said slowly, "if we were led down the wrong path entirely." The words hung in the air, a cryptic whisper that unsettled Hastings. He took a step forward, eyes wide. "You think there's someone else behind all of this?" Poirot didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed ahead, as if searching for something in the distance. "There are threads, Hastings, so many threads. But they don't end where we think they do." As they resumed walking, the quiet hum of the city surrounded them. Yet, for Poirot, the noise was a distant murmur. His thoughts were still trapped within the case, the puzzle that had begun to unravel, only to reveal new questions. What if there was a mastermind who had orchestrated the whole series of events, pulling Greaves's strings from the shadows? What if the detective himself had been manipulated, his steps guided by a hand he hadn't yet recognized? Poirot's gaze flitted to a man walking briskly ahead, his back straight and purposeful. A figure that, for a fleeting moment, reminded him of someone he had seen before. He couldn't quite place it. Just a fleeting thought, but one that clung to his mind like a fleeting scent. Hastings caught the look. "Poirot, what is it? What's on your mind?" Poirot turned back to him, his expression unreadable. Nothing, mon ami. Just a feeling. A reminder that a mystery, no matter how well it seems to be solved, often leads to another. Hastings shook his head, his brow furrowing. Are you suggesting that this case isn't truly over? Poirot paused, his mind ticking over the possibilities. He could see it all now. The woman's body in the cellar, the cryptic messages, the trail of lies and half-truths. Every answer only led to more questions, and with each answer a new mystery emerged. No, Poirot said softly, the certainty returning to his voice. I do not suggest it. I know it, Hastings. This is not the end. It is merely a pause, for the next case, for the next twist, for the next mystery, when it arrives. A chill ran down Hastings' spine. He had witnessed Poirot's brilliance countless times, but this was something different. This wasn't just a case closing, a villain caught. This was something far more unsettling, the sense that the world itself was full of hidden connections, endless mysteries waiting to be uncovered. As they neared Poirot's apartment, the detective slowed, a final thought lingering in his mind. He had solved the case of Charles Greaves, yes, but there was something more, something darker, something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. And when it revealed itself, when the next piece fell into place, Poirot would be ready. But until then, the mystery would remain, a weight he carried with him, a reminder that no answer was ever truly final. Poirot's last words before entering his door were soft almost to himself. The mystery never ends, Hastings. It only begins anew. And with that, the door clicked shut behind him.